Shy Guy in Love, SCP-096. An SCP Tale by John Hudson. Based on the original concept by Dr. Dan. Licensed under CC by SA. Part 3 Beauty and the Beast. No sooner than Sam had heard Richie scream was he alert, on his feet, and holding the little girl in front of himself as a shield, the cold steel of his 1911 drawn and pressed against her temple. "Richie!" He called out into the moonlit forest, to no response. "Richie!" He listened for a moment. Nothing. No, there was something. A quiet sound, like someone crying? Holding tightly onto the little girl, Sam began to take cautious steps towards the sound. The little girl, who was now more awake, began to struggle, becoming agitated. "Quiet," he whispered, whacking the top of her head with his pistol's grip. She squirmed even more, unbalancing Sam and sending him to the ground as he tripped over her. "Ugh," he grunted as he picked himself up. Before he could get to his feet, the moon shone through the trees onto the caved-in, bloody, severed head of his little brother Richie. Sam threw himself back in horror, his hand slipping on a severed arm. His heart raced and he began to sweat as panic sank in. It was as he pushed himself away from the horrendous sight that his hand fell upon a foot. This one was not severed, but the body above it whimpered and sobbed. Sam's eyes drifted upwards to see a giant, 6-foot-tall monstrosity. Its pale skin was luminous under the midnight moon. Its sobs turned to snarls as its dead eyes gazed down at Sam. Sam only got 2 shots out of his 1911 before meeting the same grisly fate as his brother. The little girl woke, shivering. The night had turned cold and there was no longer a warmth close by to console her. 2 loud claps in the night had pried her eyes open, bringing her back to the waking world. She shivered, her clothes moist with dew. A familiar sound came to her ears as she sat, rocking back and forth. A sound pattern she was used to only hearing from herself. A sound like a sad child. A wet, mumbled sobbing. She got on all fours and crawled towards the sound. Her progress was arrested as her hand found a long, skinny arm which shook and trembled as the rest of its mass sobbed and rocked back and forth. The touch brought her a sense of joy, as its smooth, hairless texture reminded her of Mommy's own. She rubbed the arm, enjoying the sensation and nestling closer to it. The body had a warmth that comforted her against the cold of the night, much like how Dade always felt so warm. Her touch followed the arm up to the smooth, bald head of whomever it was sitting next to her, crying. She nestled in close, absorbing its heat. She began to gently stroke the top of its head. "Pretty girl. Good girl. Sweet girl. Don't cry, little girl. Don't cry, little girl." She repeated the chant over and over as the frantic sobbing lessened. "Sweet girl. Don't cry, little girl." The sobbing ceased completely. The little girl held her hand up. "I see. I see." She ran her fingers down the face of her new friend, allowing her to see its features. Nose, brow, jaw, even teeth became apparent too. Her. "I see," she said. The creature sat, patiently. She returned to petting its head while whispering her sweet chants towards it. Her friend let a soft, nasal purr out as she did. They sat this way for a long while. "You hear that, Chief?" asked Natasha. "Gunshots." "Yes, I do. Safety's off, everyone." Gunnar flipped the switch on the side of his rifle. "Roger that, Chief." Martinez's voice came through Gunnar's comms. "Amore, has the big guy moved at all?" "Not significantly," Amore radioed back. "Just pacing the same general spot. Both teams are converging at an equal rate. You're almost right on top of it. Few more meters out." "Roger that," said Gunnar as he, Natasha, and Hex moved strategically through the bushes and trees. "Chief," Martinez buzzed in. "I've got eyes on the target. Proceeding to bag it." "Roger that," Gunnar replied as he stepped into a small clearing. The red, animated pings in his SSHUD rendered a low-resolution image of the surrounding forest, as well as Martinez, Clyde, and Deck moving towards a giant, black silhouette cut out of the digital imagery, its massive form curled up and reduced down into a fetal position. "We're here. Everyone give Martinez cover while he deploys the bag. We don't know where those gunshots came from." "Hey, Chief," Martinez said, nervously. "You ever hear 096 in his cell? Like how he's sobbing and crying? Yeah?" Gunnar replied, slightly perplexed by such an obvious question. "It's quiet. And completely sitting still." "What does that mean?" Martinez placed the bag over 096's head. 096 is secured. Removing SSHUD. Gunnar reluctantly raised his visor and squinted, letting his eyes adjust to the moonlit woods. He looked down at the creature. The entire unit, now seeing with their naked vision, all stared, perplexed, at the scene. Their monster sat silently, placated with its head bagged. However, there was a small, badly bruised 10-year-old girl cuddling with it, her arms wrapped around its torso. "Chief?" Hex turned to Gunnar, unsure of how to make out the sight. "She's blind. Can't see its face," replied Gunnar, turning his attention back to the task at hand. "Amore, target is secure. Preparing to march back to extraction." "Copy that, Chief," replied Amore. "Dr. Daniels, contact Site 19 and let them know there's a juvenile NPC needing medical evacuation." Gunnar turned back to the creature. "Martinez, get her off of 096 so we can get it to the extraction point." Martinez nodded, slinging his rifle back over his shoulder as he bent down to grab the little girl by her waist. She resisted, pulling tighter onto 096. She began kicking her feet at Martinez, landing one foot on his nose. He stumbled back a little, then went back in more forcefully. The little girl began to scream. "Good girl. Pretty girl. Good girl." She rallied as Martinez struggled to get a solid grip on her. The little girl kicked her feet against the coarse patterns of Kevlar and burlap which scraped against her skin as it bound her into a jacket of claustrophobia, then further tore her away from the warmth which had rescued her so much time ago. Panic overcame her as she screamed to be reunited, reaching out as the chaos which was swallowing her tore her further away from the hand of her new familiarity. "Good girl." She screamed frantically, "Good girl. Good girl. Sweet girl. Don't cry, little girl." The tears and snot ran down her face as unfamiliar voices barked in the dark. She could hear her friend begin to sob and mutter indistinguishable sentences, becoming mildly agitated. For a moment she almost broke free, which was enough for her to wrap her tiny arms back around the head of her friend, who she could feel sobbing and rocking back and forth. "Good girl. Sweet girl," she continued as the rough, coarse thing continued to pull her away by both of her feet. "Eat your food, little girl," she screamed at the top of her lungs, with as much distress as she could muster. "Eat your food, little girl. Eat your food, little girl." Her hand momentarily grabbed onto something that wasn't skin and she could feel and hear this something untethering, then falling to the ground. "Eat your food, little girl." An overpowering, echoing mass of sound bellowed into the night, something like half human rage and half a lion's roar, as the little girl fell to the wooded ground with a hard thud. The air around her filled with a violent collage of zips, screams, and thuds as the little girl's face became bombarded with the occasional spray of a thick, warm rain. She rocked back and forth on the ground, hugging her knees until exhaustion overtook her, sending her into a deep sleep. Gunnar winced and averted his eyes in a moment of reflex. Had he seen it? Had he seen 096's face? The neurons and pathways in his brain ignited, piecing together and processing the last trillionth of a second in slow motion, until his memory finally settled onto the image of a nose, a jaw extending well past human capabilities, and a single, dead, pale eye, turning towards him. He finally knew what it looked like. He had seen its face. Gunnar raised his rifle up. His entire unit, SSHUDs not deployed, were firing round after round into the creature. Idiots. He thought, realizing his entire team was compromised and now dead. He raised his eye up to the scope but didn't aim at 096. The creature had Hex in its claws, holding onto his left arm and the right side of his hip. Hex's bones began to crackle under the strain and began to show rips in his uniform just before a single round was placed with perfect precision between his eyes. The creature didn't react, but simply dropped Hex's corpse to the ground and turned its attention towards Clyde, who fell limp before 096 could even take a step. The recoil of the rifle had no effect on Gunnar's movements. 096 reached out without looking and grabbed hold of Deck's neck, squeezing it until his head popped off like a swollen pimple exploding. Gunnar put a round into the head midair, then set his sights on Martinez, who seemed to have now understood what was happening. He held his hands up to Gunnar in protest, but Gunnar fired a round which tore through Martinez's finger and into his left eye septum. His lifeless body fell limp where it once stood. Gunnar and 096 both turned to Natasha. She had stopped firing, her rifle on the ground where she'd dropped it. She was facing Gunnar, oblivious to 096's violent lunge toward her. Her sidearm was placed at her temple. "Do svidaniya, Chief," she smiled with a wink before pulling the trigger. 096 landed on her lifeless body, no longer interested in her. Its face slowly turned towards Gunnar. "I see you, you son of a bitch," he said, throwing his rifle to the ground. Gunnar lunged at 096, who began running towards him, screaming and roaring. Gunner landed a firm right hook onto the creature's face. Back at Mobile Command, Amore watched as the last white blip on his radar went dark, leaving 096 as the only marker on the screen. Amore jumped to his feet and ran out of the Mobile Command van, into the woods. Dr. Daniels sat motionless, her hand over her mouth with an expression of terror at the massacre which had just unfolded. And the girl? She was severely dehydrated, but other than a fractured nasal bone had only superficial bruises and cuts. We're currently treating her wounds on site and I've ordered a drip of saline and Class B amnestics. After that, she'll be returned to her family. Bureau of Misinformation is working on a cover story as we speak. Good work, Doctor. Dr. Daniels gave a courteous nod of acknowledgement with a half-hearted smile. I see you've put in for a transfer. Anything I can do to dissuade you from leaving? No, she said bluntly. I've worked on 096 for a decade now. After watching it dismember Mobile Task Force Pareidolia, I'm due for a change of scenery. I know you've left considerable notes, but I'd like you to stay just long enough to train your replacement. That's reasonable, she said. At that moment there was a knock at the office door. Come in, called the director. Ah, speak of the devil and he shall appear. The director got up from behind his desk and approached the man, shaking his hand. The man was seemingly in his late 40s or early 50s, donning a white lab coat. Dr. Daniels, let me introduce you to your replacement. The man stuck his hand out with a smile. Well, that'll be easy to remember. Hello, Dr. Daniels. I'm Dr. Dan.
Hey guys, John here with Forgotten Tales, and there you have it, the epic conclusion of the 3-part Shy Guy in Love. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope you hit that subscribe button so that I can bring you more tales from the SCP universe we all love. Anyway, take care of yourselves, guys. Be blessed.